Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. An important topic? Let's do it. What pieces of history are being deliberately erased from existence? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Everyone seems to know about North Korea being a nasty place, but they forget the country that's fighting it out with North Korea to be the worst in any given category, Eritrea. It's in Africa, across the strait from Yemen and very not part of Ethiopia. Military dictator, the law is what he says it is. Conscription, displacement, the works. But little corruption. See, the law is what he says it is, which means that anything he does is legal. And if anyone does what he doesn't want, they've committed suicide. The Rohingya is a very interesting one. They've been indigenous to the Rakhine state for centuries before being driven out in 2016. They were butchered and murdered, barred and expelled with all evidence of being omitted from Burmese records. They now are spread all across Asia, where they are met with great hostilities and are currently globe-hopping, longing to return home. So in Sri Lanka, the British left two rival kingdoms as one democratic country. Predictably, the larger Sinhala kingdom voted their own people in and started persecuting the people who'd belonged to the smaller Tamil kingdom. After many race riots in which the Tamil men, women, and children were hacked to death and burned alive while Sinhalese police stood by or joined in, a small number of victims managed to organize their own resistance force, the LTTE. They fought and negotiated for independence, or at least a two-state system, so they could run their own country instead of the Sinhalese, but were called terrorists. After a huge injection of aid money to Sri Lanka after the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, surprise, the Sinhalese government somehow now had a lot more weapons. They finished off what they'd started, killing Tamils indiscriminately. At the end, they refused international observers, aid workers, UN, and journalists access, told the Tamils, "We're only attacking combatants, so go here to the safe exclusion zone if you're just a civilian," and then shelled the civilians, including women and children in that zone. Tens of thousands dead. They say there's peace now in Sri Lanka. Can you really call it that when the bad guys just finished murdering all their victims? The business plot. Yes, a group of powerful Wall Street types tried to raise an army of 500,000 men to take the White House by force, overthrow FDR, and put a fascist government in his place. And yes, Congress investigated it under seal and concluded the plot was real, but never named the conspirators, kind of like what's happening with Epstein. If anyone is more knowledgeable about the topic than me, please correct or inform me, but from what I've picked up through podcasts and documentaries, the British and Irish governments are desperately trying to forget collusion in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. There's heavy accusations of collaboration between MI5 and RUC and loyalist paramilitaries in the Gardaí Irish Army and the Provisional IRA. But there's still a lot of people alive who would be compromised if all that information came out. Expansionist Japan and the atrocities they committed during the 1930s are completely skipped over in most school curriculum, even though it was less than 100 years ago. I've always found that baffling. In World War II, how France people in general were pretty okay and open to Nazi ideals. Under occupation, shipping people to camps, etc., but they pretty much rewrote the history, glorifying the resistance force who were just a little group of individuals resisting Nazi occupation. Sweden tried to assimilate Sami people by outlawing their language in schools and outlawing yoiking, traditional chanting and drumming. Sami women were secretly sterilized by the Swedish government, and the program lasted until the 1970s. By the way, secret sterilization without consent happened to Native American women at IHS hospitals in the United States through the 1970s, and in Australia to Aboriginal women as well. The secret police in communist Romania, the Securitate, who would arrest, beat, and torture those who opposed the regime, and its numerous collaborators who stabbed their neighbors in the back for benefits. I feel like it's not talked about enough. Right now, there are a lot of older people who were part of the Securitate who never got punished for their actions. You can just see them walking on the street. the radical politics of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., particularly toward the end of his life. In his writings and speeches, he was far more radical than what is conventionally touted. Corporations wrapped themselves in MLK quotes on January 15th and April 4th, but I would imagine that if Dr. King were alive today, he would be horrified at the level of wealth that these private sector entities have accumulated, while we continually fail to provide the basic necessities for human dignity, such as affordable housing and living wages. I also wonder if his anger wouldn't just be directed at wealthy corporate interests, but at the many progressive special interests that promote idealistic solutions to satisfy their own self-righteousness, but result in nothing for the people they are supposedly fighting for. That the rest of the civilized world had a chance to save the genocide of the German Jews, but the willingness to do something wasn't there. In the conference in Evian in 1938, the world leaders met to discuss how to prevent the genocide, but very few countries actually offered to receive any significant number of refugees of common people. Not really talked about today, but Jews were generally not considered good citizens in most places, and the world leaders were afraid of the public to accept Jewish refugees, except for scientists, musical artists, and wealthy families. Adolf Hitler said ahead of the conference that if they were so concerned about the Jewish population, he would gladly ship all German Jews on a luxury liner to any country that would accept to receive them. After the conference, his conclusion was that the genocide wouldn't meet any sincere opposition from the Allies, since they refused to do anything about it other than talk. It's an interesting topic that I think more people should talk about. Obviously, the motives of the Nazi Party were, at the time, pretty well known. And how did the world respond? Makes you wonder. Not a race, but little known outside Alsace and Moselle, the story of Malgré nous, in spite of ourselves. These are the people who, after the German invasion during the Second World War, had to fight on the German side. Otherwise, their families would be shot or sent to concentration camps. The labor history of most of the world. People have little idea that things people today take for granted or even scoff at were fought with for blood. Those who brag about working long hours or laugh at safety regulations spit on their graves. Unit 731 isn't widely talked about outside of internet forums. Japan had deliberately tried to obfuscate its atrocities in World War II, sort of using Germany as the big bad guy and hoping people don't think about Japan's activities in China and Korea. Largely, they've been successful. Others have said Native American history, and that's certainly true, but I want to specify something important about this: their languages. Many tribes of selected tongues have only a handful of speakers left, and many of them are elderly, and before too long after they pass, these languages will be dead. It's extremely unfortunate that there's little to no effort to try to retain these languages, keep them alive, and keep them going for future generations, but that's unlikely. Probably within a few short years, many of these languages will be gone forever. The eradication of French from Louisiana. It's never talked about at all in U.S. history courses, and it's only as of this past decade that Louisiana is bringing back French immersion schools and French theaters to try to repair the damage. At the start of the 20th century, it was estimated roughly 3/4 of all Louisianans spoke French as their first language. By the 1920s, the state had banned French for reasons pertaining to seeing the specific dialect as being uncivilized, and to make the state more like the others. Prior to this, the Creole and dialect of French in Louisiana had been considered savage, and attempts to make them speak proper French were being done. The tactic used to get rid of the French were the exact same ones used on the Native Americans. The state purposely imported people from surrounding states who couldn't speak a word of French, and teachers who only spoke English were brought in. Students who attempted to speak French were punished via corporal punishment. By the 1960s, less than half of Louisiana was French-speaking. Today, in 2024, it's less than 10% of the population. The state only unbanned French in the 80s, but by then the damage had been done. If you were born in the 1900s, Louisiana, you were amongst the last generation who had en masse truly be fluent in French or Creole. By the 1910s, likely amongst the last to have some understanding. 1920s to 1980s is half a century where you were forbidden to speak your language at all in public or in schools. Many Louisianans stopped teaching their kids French because of the direction the state went, and the languages nearly died off. This was an extremely unique part of the American culture we let die. In my country, there are some dark events in history that are kind of swept under the carpet because the reminder of these events brings so much shame. One such event is the experiments of Wartime. They wanted to experiment the process of teeth decay and sugar's effect on it. So they conducted these experiments in a mental institution where they offered nothing else than sweets, candy, sugar, etc. to people living there. The people in these experiments never consented to doing these, nor did they understand what it was they were doing. It resulted in these people having their teeth ruined for life. So the people conducting these experiments were abusing the people living in the institution. The Germans were never in the dark or unaware of the Nazi regime's intentions and plans. Nobody was fooled during the election. Nobody was fooled during the war. Nobody was in the dark about the harsh anti-Jewish policies. It was all very openly discussed. It's simply a victim's mentality meant to water down the fact that they were all indirectly complicit. I feel that Mesopotamian history is largely ignored in high schools because it predates the Bible. At least here in the Netherlands, it receives way less attention than the Roman Empire and ancient Greece. Some Mesopotamian stories have been inspirations for biblical stories. Noah's Ark, for example, from the Epic of Gilgamesh. The history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Everyone associates Northern Ireland with the IRA, the de facto baddies, while significantly fewer know of the UVF, or why the IRA existed at all. Clue: Catholics couldn't get social housing. Their votes counted for nothing since the entire country was gerrymandered into the Unionists' favor, and since only landowners and their wife usually could vote, the majority of Catholics couldn't vote anyway. This is likely due to the much louder voice in the UK has on the international stage than Ireland did, and still does. There is also the basic narrative that it was about religious differences. It wasn't. It was about people who identified as Irish and those who identified as British. Irish and Catholicism closely correlated, as did British and Protestantism, but it wasn't the root source of the conflict. Pre-Islamic culture in the Middle East. I've spent over 5 years here and visited a lot of historical sites in Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. It's sad how deliberate the lack of funding is for old non-Muslim sites or just a blatant rewriting. In Iran, unsurprisingly, it's the worst. Sasanian and Persian sites are almost becoming non-existent outside of a few important ones, and even those are receiving less funding and deteriorating. At the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, a historical church, 95% of the information is about it being a mosque and its Ottoman history. The Byzantine era is seen almost as a footnote in Turkey, which is an insane level of propaganda. There's hardly any exhibits dedicated to Byzantines, but so many are made about the Ottomans. In Iraq and Syria, it's not the fault of democratic governments, but of Daesh, ISIL, IS. I've been Palmyra only after the occupation, and as a history lover, I was angry. Nivene, too. Just shameful. Jordan and Egypt are probably the better examples of preserving history in the region, as I didn't see any obvious bias. The Netherlands has deliberately tried for centuries to glorify its history by telling lies, damned lies, and fabricate statistics. Most of the Golden Age is just as golden as the value of tulips after the stock exchange crashed. Sometimes the Netherlands tries to paint itself as uniquely rich, innovative, or tolerant, while they always had parallels in other nearby countries. In first instance, Dutch media swept all atrocities under the rug. This is no longer possible due to pressure in these post-colonial times. However, internal atrocities are still swept under the rug. Why did the folks literally eat De Witt? Was the decline in Brabant really such a void period that only saw folks actually moving north? Did Catholics even have more rights in the north than in any other Protestant state? Even as I hate Catholicism myself, Catholics were treated like dog shit in the north, just like anywhere else. The mob in The Hague that ate De Witt was piss poor, and folks in Brabant went fleeing what was a deliberate famine, genocide caused by the troops of William the Silent, who burned down half the current-day province of Nord-Brabant, like a bunch of maniacs. That in the city where I live, William the Silent is celebrated as a hero is a disgrace. He was a silent murderer at best. The rest of the country wasn't really that rich either. Money landed in the hands of the regents and bourgeois, and the stock exchange was a new tool for them to keep the money circulating in the higher classes. And this is probably not the only country where a golden age is probably a myth. The motives of the South in the U.S. Civil War. They wanted to keep their slaves. The rich aristocrats wanted to keep their slaves and whipped the people into a fervor over it. Every single secession proclamation directly mentions or alludes to slavery as the primary cause. Not one mentions states' rights, which, by the way, is a BS stance anyway, considering the violation of states' rights that was the Fugitive Slave Act. But the notion of a lost cause or fighting for states' rights is nonsense revisionism that has been created and pushed by openly racist individuals and organizations until it was accepted as fact by those ignorant to the lies and bias. It's part of a concerted and actually documented effort by white supremacists to rewrite the history of the South and the Civil War.